Your Majesty, she is here. His Majesty has chosen me to be his new queen. Act as if you know nothing.
Majesty, she is here. The maid's voice trembled at the doors of the royal apartments, and the sound carried through the long gallery like a frightened bird. Queen Amara did not look up from the small weaving frame in her lap. Her fingers continued their patient work, pulling the golden thread through the dark indigo cloth with the calm of a woman who had learned long ago that stillness was her only armor. "Show her in," she said quietly, and the maid vanished like smoke. A moment later, her childhood friend walked into the room wearing the brightest smile Amara had ever seen on a human face. Zuri lifted her left hand as though she were presenting a trophy to the gods, and the enormous gold ring on her finger caught the afternoon sun that poured through the tall windows of the palace. It was the royal seal of the House of Kandara, and there was only one man in the kingdom who could place that ring on a woman's hand. "I came to tell you myself," Zuri said, and her voice was sweet and proud at once. "His Majesty has asked me to become his queen." Everyone in the palace had been waiting for this moment, waiting to see Queen Amara cry, to scream, to tear her robes and scratch the eyes out of the woman who stood before her. The servants pressed themselves against the far wall, hardly daring to breathe. The old housekeeper, Mama Ama, lowered her head because she could not bear to watch. Instead, Amara set down her weaving frame, rose from her chair, walked across the room, took both of Zuri's hands in her own, and smiled. "Congratulations," she said, and her voice was so warm that even Zuri blinked in confusion. "You're not angry," Zuri whispered. Amara laughed softly, and there was no bitterness in the sound. "Why would I be angry?" She leaned closer, until only the two of them could hear her next words. Then she whispered, "You think you are taking my throne, Zuri. You are only taking my sentence." Zuri laughed at that. She thought her old friend was trying to hide her heartbreak behind riddles, the way the weak always did. She had no idea that those 11 words would become the most terrifying sentence she would ever remember, the sentence she would repeat to herself in the dark hours of the night until the day she died. Before I tell you why the most forgiving queen in the kingdom smiled, while another woman walked into her marriage, please support this channel by liking the video, subscribing, and writing in the comments where you are watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive, and I promise you, this is a story you will not forget. Now, let us return to the beginning, to the day the entire kingdom believed Queen Amara was the luckiest woman alive. The festival of the first rains came every autumn to the Kingdom of Kandara, and it was the grandest celebration in all the 7 provinces. Nobles traveled for weeks to reach the capital, riding through the Baobab Plains and across the Great Nzara River, hoping to stand in the presence of the king, to strengthen alliances between houses, or simply to be seen among the highest ranks of the realm. The Golden Pinnacle, the palace of the House of Kandara, opened its great carved doors to receive them all. That night, the great hall blazed with 1,000 oil lamps, their flames reflecting off the gold-leafed pillars that the ancestors had raised 300 years before. Drummers lined the eastern gallery, and the deep thunder of the Ngoma drums shook the floor beneath the dancers' feet. Dukes of the high provinces, queens of the southern islands, merchants of the eastern trade roads, and ambassadors from the kingdoms beyond the desert gathered beneath one roof, dressed in their finest cloth. Just as the master of ceremonies raised his staff, the enormous doors swung open, and every conversation died at once. King Osei entered first, tall and commanding in his flowing robe of deep emerald velvet threaded with gold, a crown of woven gold and red coral resting on his head. Beside him walked Queen Amara, breathtaking in a gown of ivory silk dyed with patterns no other weaver in the kingdom could produce. The cloth of her own hands, the cloth the court had begun to call the Queen's Weave. A collar of blue beads, made by her mother's hands many years before, rested around her neck. Every eye in the hall followed them. Even the Queen Mother, who had never once smiled at Amara, nodded with grudging approval as they approached. Throughout the evening, the unmarried daughters of the great houses attempted to invite the king onto the dance floor, one after another. And one after another he declined with his famous charming laugh. "I am honored," he said each time, "but every dance tonight belongs to my queen." A wave of admiration swept across the hall. The women of the court looked at Amara with envy painted plainly on their faces. Near the refreshment tables, two countesses whispered behind their fans, "If my husband looked at me half the way His Majesty looks at his queen, I would never complain again." Her companion nodded. She was born in a fishing village with nothing but a weaving frame. Now she wears the jewel collar of a queen. Fortune truly smiled upon her. Not far away stood Zuri Nyoroga, daughter of a wealthy cloth merchant of the eastern province, applauding politely with everyone else. But her smile concealed a growing bitterness that she had nursed for years. She watched the king's affectionate gaze follow Amara around the hall. She admired the priceless bead collar and the flawless weave of the queen's gown. She noticed how every noble in the room bowed respectfully whenever Amara passed. And a single thought turned over and over inside her mind, like a stone in a river. Why does she deserve this life, and not me? Amara noticed her friend watching from the edge of the hall and walked over during the next pause in the music. "I am so happy you came," she said warmly, embracing Zuri. "I would not have missed it for anything." Zuri returned the embrace and forced another smile. "You truly have everything, Amara." The queen hesitated for a moment before answering in a voice too low for anyone else to hear. "Not everything." Zuri laughed, assuming she was simply being modest, the way the fortunate always pretended to be. She never imagined those two words carried more pain than 1,000 confessions. Hours later, the celebration came to an end, and King Osei personally helped his wife into their carriage before climbing in beside her. As the cool night breeze drifted through the open windows, he unfolded a thick woven blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders with a tenderness that made the stable boys exchange admiring glances. "Have you ever seen a king so devoted?" one of them whispered. The older coachman smiled. "His Majesty has never allowed the queen to step onto the ground without offering his hand first." Inside the carriage, Amara thanked her husband with a gentle smile. Only she knew that the smile was forced. Silently, she counted every passing mile, and the closer they came to the palace gates, the heavier her heart became. The carriage rolled through the towering iron gates of the inner court. Moments later, the great bronze doors of the royal apartments closed behind them with a deep echo that seemed to swallow every trace of warmth. The servants quietly disappeared into the corridors. Without warning, the king reached toward his wife. His fingers wrapped around the blue bead collar that her mother had made, and with one violent pull, the threads snapped, and the beads scattered across the marble floor like fallen stars, rolling into every corner of the room. "You smiled too warmly at the Prince of the Eastern Islands," he said coldly. Amara stared in disbelief. "He only offered his congratulations on the festival." Her sentence never ended. His open hand struck her face so hard that she lost her balance and fell against the carved table. Silence filled the room. Outside the doorway, the elderly housekeeper lowered her head and gently pulled the door shut. She had heard that sound countless times before, and she had learned, like everyone else in the palace, to pretend she had not. Inside, the king ordered his wife to kneel, and she obeyed without protest. He criticized everything about her, the way she had greeted the queen mother, the way she had walked beside him, the way she had laughed at the ambassador's joke, even the way she breathed during the evening. According to his own impossible standards, she had embarrassed him 100 times in a single night. Nothing she ever did pleased him, and when he finally turned to leave, he paused at the doorway and said without looking back, "Tomorrow morning, the kingdom will once again see a happy queen." Amara swallowed the tears burning behind her eyes. "Yes, Your Majesty." Far beyond the palace, in the small fishing village of Mwezi, on the banks of the Nzara River, Amara's family lived in a different world entirely. Her father, Okoye Nwosu, greeted their neighbors with a pride he had carried like a banner ever since his daughter became queen. "The day my daughter married His Majesty was the greatest blessing our family ever received," he would say at every gathering. Thanks to the king's generosity, her brother Emeka attended the Royal Guard Academy in the capital, training to become an officer of the king's own guard. Her younger sister Adiz studied etiquette and cloth making at the finest finishing school in the eastern province. Every season, wagons from the Golden Pinnacle arrived at the village, carrying sacks of grain, herds of cattle, and enough gold to keep the family comfortable for a year. They believed their daughter's marriage had rescued them all. They never once asked what it had cost her. Back at the palace, after everyone had fallen asleep, Amara sat on the edge of her bed and placed a trembling hand over her stomach. For the first time that entire day, a genuine smile appeared on her face. She closed her eyes and whispered to the empty room, "Perhaps this child will soften his heart." The weeks that followed brought an unfamiliar feeling into Amara's life. Hope. For the first time since becoming queen, she woke each morning with something to look forward to, a tiny secret growing inside her. Hidden beneath the elegant gowns and carefully practiced smiles was a life she had dreamed of protecting. Every morning before the servants arrived, she would rest her hands over her stomach and whisper gentle words to the child only she knew existed. She refused to tell the king, not yet. She wanted the moment to be special, and she still believed, with the stubborn faith of a woman who had known cruelty, that becoming a father might awaken the kindness he only pretended to possess before the rest of the realm. Inside her private sitting room, she spent many afternoons weaving tiny baby cloths at her loom by the window. She wove soft patterns of blue and white into blankets no larger than her two hands, and she stitched a small pair of shoes softer than anything the palace goldsmith had ever made. One afternoon, the palace's oldest weaver, a woman named Mama Effia, who had served 3 kings, quietly entered the room carrying a bundle of dyed thread. She stopped when she noticed the tiny garment spread across the table. A gentle smile appeared on the old woman's weathered face. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "does the king know?" Amara looked down at the cloth in her hands and slowly shook her head. "Not yet. I want to surprise him." For a brief moment, even the old weaver allowed herself to believe that happiness had finally found its way into the Golden Pinnacle. "I pray this child brings peace into your home," she said softly. "So do I," Amara replied. Unfortunately, peace never came. Several evenings later, the king returned to the palace after a long council with the elders of the 7 provinces. He arrived exhausted and already irritated by matters far beyond the palace walls. Dinner had been prepared exactly as he had ordered. Everything was perfect, except the soup. One of the kitchen girls had suddenly fallen ill, delaying the meal by a few minutes, and by the time the bronze bowl reached the king's table, the soup had gone cold. The king lifted his golden spoon, tasted it once, and his expression darkened like a storm. "Cold," he said, and the word fell into the room like a stone into still water. No one dared speak. Amara gently reached for the bowl. "I will have them warm it immediately." She never finished the sentence. The king grabbed the heavy bronze serving platter and hurled it across the dining hall. It struck her across the body before crashing onto the floor, and the sound of metal on marble echoed through the halls. Amara gasped as pain shot through her, and she collapsed beside the table. The servants rushed forward, then froze as the king glared at them. No one moved. Then a young maid screamed. Blood slowly spread across the queen's pale gown, dark and terrible against the ivory cloth. The royal physician, a grave man named Dr. Senham, was summoned immediately, and he worked through the night, refusing to leave her bedside. Outside the room, the servants gathered in silence, praying to the ancestors for both mother and child. Just after sunrise, the physician finally stepped out, and his face said everything before he opened his mouth. He lowered his head. "I am deeply sorry, Your Majesty. We could not save the child." Amara closed her eyes, and no tears came. She simply stretched out a trembling hand toward the table where Mama Effia had placed the tiny blue and white blanket she had spent weeks weaving. She held it tightly against her chest, and that small blanket was the only thing she would ever have of her child. She fell asleep holding it. When she awoke that afternoon, the king entered her room, and for a foolish moment she believed he had come to comfort her. Instead, he stood at the foot of the bed and looked at her with complete indifference. "Perhaps the ancestors were wise," he said coldly. They spare the kingdom the bloodline of a weakling. Without another word, he turned and left. Amara stared at the closed door long after he had gone, and something inside her began to break. 3 days later, still too weak to stand for long, she secretly left the palace. She traveled to the small village where she had grown up, and the moment her mother opened the door, Amara rushed into her arms and burst into tears. "My daughter, what has happened?" Her father hurried over from the fire. For the first time in weeks, Amara felt safe. She believed she had finally reached the people who would protect her. Slowly, she rolled back the sleeves of her dress, and the room went silent. Dark bruises covered both arms. Fresh marks crossed her wrists. Purple stains spread across her shoulders. Then, through trembling lips, she whispered, "He killed my baby." The room became completely silent. Her mother covered her mouth with both hands and began to sob. Amara thought everything was finally going to change. Instead, her father asked quietly, "Did anyone see you come here?" She could hardly breathe. "I came because I need your help." Okoye lowered his eyes. "If you leave the king, Emeka loses his place at the Royal Guard Academy. Adesa will be expelled from finishing school. The king will stop supporting this family, and we will lose everything. Everything, Amara." She looked toward her mother, certain that Chiamaka would defend her. Instead, her mother took both of her hands and whispered through tears, "My child, please endure just a little longer. For the sake of your brother, for the sake of your sister." Before Amara could answer, the door opened, and her brother Emeka walked in wearing the uniform of a cadet. He had heard every word. She looked at him hopefully, and he slowly walked toward her, then knelt before her. "Please, Amara, just until I receive my commission, do not destroy my future." Those words hurt more than the king's cruelty ever had, because they came from the people she loved. As evening fell, Amara quietly returned to the palace, and the king was already waiting for her in the great hall. He looked at her swollen eyes and smiled with quiet satisfaction. "Your family reminded you where you belong, didn't they?" She lowered her head, and for the first time in her life, she understood that she had nowhere left to run. Winter gave way to spring, and life at the Golden Pinnacle settled into a painful routine. The bruises on Amara's body faded, only to be replaced by new ones. The servants had stopped reacting whenever they heard shouting from the king's private chambers. They simply lowered their heads and continued their work, pretending not to hear what everyone already knew. Amara no longer cried after every beating. She no longer begged for mercy. She had learned that silence often shortened his anger. Every morning she dressed in elegant gowns, covered the marks on her skin with powder, smiled politely before the household, and fulfilled every duty expected of a queen. Every evening she returned to her room exhausted, not because of the work, but because pretending that everything was normal had become the hardest labor of her life. The woman who had once dreamed of changing her husband had quietly begun to accept that some people never change. Then, when she least expected it, hope returned. Several months after losing her first child, the royal physician confirmed what she had hardly dared to believe. She was expecting another baby. Amara sat in stunned silence while Dr. Senam carefully folded away his instruments. "Congratulations, Your Majesty," he said gently. "The child appears healthy." She thanked him, but before he reached the door, she stopped him. "I beg you," she said, and he turned around. "Please do not tell His Majesty." The physician hesitated. "My lady," she shook her head. "If he does not know, perhaps this child will live." The physician understood immediately, and he gave a respectful nod before leaving without another question. Only one other person learned the secret, Mama Ama, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Golden Pinnacle for more than 30 years. When Amara finally trusted her with the news, tears filled the old woman's eyes. "This time," she whispered, taking both of the queen's hands, "we will protect this little one." Amara smiled faintly. "I do not need anything else. I only want this child to survive." The old housekeeper promised that the secret would remain between them, and for the first time in months, Amara allowed herself to dream again. Around that same period, another familiar face became a regular visitor to the palace. Zuri Nyoroga began arriving almost every week. Sometimes she brought freshly picked flowers from her family's gardens. Other days she arrived carrying books, sweet pastries from the capital's finest bakers, or rare teas she insisted Amara should try. She never arrived empty-handed. "I cannot bear the thought of you feeling lonely in this enormous palace," Zuri often said, and Amara welcomed every visit with genuine gratitude. After the disappointment she had suffered from her own family, having someone who willingly spent time with her felt like a blessing. The afternoons they spent together became the brightest moments of her week. They wove together at the queen's loom, read old story scrolls beside the fire, and walked through the palace gardens discussing the memories of their childhood. For a little while, Amara almost remembered what happiness felt like. She never noticed what everyone else quietly observed. Whenever Zuri complimented the king, her voice softened. Whenever he entered the room, she straightened her posture and smiled a little wider. She laughed more freely at his jokes than anyone else. She praised his wisdom during council discussions. She admired his leadership whenever the affairs of the provinces were mentioned. "His Majesty has remarkable judgment," she would often say. "The people of the provinces are fortunate to have such a wise king." Amara simply smiled. She felt relieved to hear laughter inside the palace again. She foolishly believed that Zuri's cheerful company was easing the tension between her and her husband. She never imagined there was another reason for the king's improving mood. Then everything collapsed. One afternoon, while organizing the cloth chests for the coming season, the king entered her dressing room unexpectedly, and his eyes immediately fell upon several tiny garments carefully hidden inside an open chest. A woven blanket, a pair of miniature shoes, a delicate baby gown. He slowly lifted one of them, and his face darkened. "What is this?" Amara froze. She had forgotten to lock the chest. She stepped forward nervously. "I wanted to tell you," he interrupted her. "You plan to hide this from me?" His voice rose with every word. "You plan to keep my own child a secret?" She tried to explain. "I was afraid." And the king heard those words as an accusation rather than a confession. Without warning, he shoved her violently away from him. She stumbled backward, and her foot caught the edge of the platform outside the dressing room. She lost her balance, and Amara tumbled down the long marble staircase of the palace, striking each step before collapsing motionless at the bottom. Mama Amma rushed into the hallway and screamed for the physician. Servants came running from every direction. Hours later, Dr. Senem emerged from the bedroom with sorrow written across his face. He looked directly at Amara. "I am deeply sorry. The child is gone again." The room became unbearably quiet. The physician gathered enough courage to face the king. "Your Majesty," he said firmly, "the queen's body has endured severe trauma. If this violence continues, I am afraid she may never carry another child." The king's expression never changed. "Then she has no purpose as my queen." Amara heard every word through the slightly open door of the bedroom, and she closed her eyes. This time, she did not cry. That evening, unable to sleep, she stood beside the window that overlooked the entrance to the palace, and she watched a carriage roll through the gates. Zuri stepped out carrying a bouquet of white lilies. To Amara's surprise, the king himself walked outside to greet her, accepting the flowers with a warm smile, a smile so gentle, so effortless, that it was a smile Amara could no longer remember ever receiving herself. As she watched them disappear into the moon garden together, she rested one hand against the cold window glass and whispered quietly, "So that is where his kindness went." Sleep abandoned Amara that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the tiny white blanket she had woven for the child she would never hold. The silence inside the palace felt heavier than ever, and the emptiness in her heart refused to let her rest. Just after midnight, she noticed movement outside her window, a lantern flickering in the gardens. Curious, she quietly wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and slipped out of her room without waking the servants. The palace gardens stretched peacefully beneath the moonlight. Marble statues of the ancestors cast long shadows across the walking paths, and the scent of blooming jasmine drifted through the warm night air. She followed the faint sound of laughter, and it was not difficult to recognize, for the king rarely laughed, and when he did, it was never inside his own home. She slowed her steps as she approached the ancient baobab tree that stood near the fountain. Then she stopped. The king was standing beneath its branches, and facing him was Zuri, her childhood friend. The king gently held both of Zuri's hands, the same hands that had struck his wife countless times, now touching another woman with tenderness. Amara remained hidden behind the trunk of another tree, and neither of them noticed her. I almost pity her, Zuri said quietly. The king smirked. You pity my wife? She is not the woman you deserve anymore. Zuri's eyes lowered before she asked the question she had clearly rehearsed many times. If you were free, would you choose me? The king did not hesitate. Soon I will have no reason to keep her. Zuri's face lit with excitement. Then I will finally become queen. Amara waited for the pain. She expected her heart to shatter. She expected tears. Instead, she felt something she had not experienced in years, relief. She leaned against the tree and quietly closed her eyes. A faint smile appeared on her face. Thank you, she whispered, not to them, not to fate, but to the unexpected door that had just opened in front of her. For years she had searched for a way to escape the golden pinnacle. She had believed that death might be the only door left open. Now another door had appeared. Someone else wanted her place. Someone else was willing to stand exactly where she had stood. And at that moment, she made a decision: she would never fight for the king again. If Zuri wanted the crown, she could have it, along with everything that came with it. The following morning, Amara knelt beside her bed and carefully lifted a loose floorboard hidden beneath the carpet. Inside rested a small leather pouch containing only a handful of gold coins, not enough to begin a new life, but enough to begin preparing for one. Every week afterward, she quietly added another coin. She sold pieces of jewelry the king had long forgotten giving her. Nothing large enough to attract attention, only bracelets, brooches, and trinkets that could disappear unnoticed. She asked Mama Effia, the old weaver, to teach her the advanced weaving patterns used only for the king's own regalia. The old woman looked surprised. Your Majesty, she said, why would a queen need to earn a living with her hands? Amara smiled gently. Because crowns do not always last forever. The weaver asked no further questions. She simply began teaching. In the afternoons, Amara spent time with the palace steward under the excuse of reviewing the household accounts. Instead, she learned bookkeeping, how to calculate expenses, how to negotiate prices, how successful merchants manage their businesses. Whenever traders arrived at the palace, she paid close attention to their conversations. She studied cloth, dyes, trade routes, and luxury goods. She listened far more than she spoke, and every lesson carried the same purpose. If freedom finally came, she intended to survive it. A few days later, Amara invited Zuri for afternoon tea. The table was beautifully arranged in the glass conservatory overlooking the gardens, with fresh pastries sitting untouched between them. For a while they spoke about ordinary things, the weather, the coming harvest, the latest celebration at court. Then Amara sighed deeply. I have failed His Majesty, she said. Zuri immediately reached across the table. Do not say that. Amara looked down into her teacup. I do love him, but love is not always enough. Zuri remained silent. Amara continued quietly. He deserves someone who understands his ambitions, someone who can stand proudly beside a powerful king. She looked directly at her friend. I do not think that woman is me anymore. For a brief second, a spark appeared in Zuri's eyes, and she tried to hide it, but Amara noticed. Then she added one final sentence. He deserves someone stronger than I am. Zuri quickly lowered her gaze to hide the smile forming on her lips. She spoke words of comfort, but her heart had already accepted an invitation Amara had never truly offered. As Zuri's carriage disappeared through the palace gates that evening, Amara knew exactly what would happen next. She had not pushed her friend toward the king. She had simply removed every reason to hesitate. That night, after the household had fallen asleep, she opened the leather diary she had kept since her wedding day. Many earlier pages were stained with tears. Others contained prayers begging the ancestors to save her marriage. She turned to a blank page, dipped her pen into ink, and wrote only one sentence. Today I stopped praying for my marriage to survive, and I started preparing for my freedom. Across the great hall, the king looked up from his council scrolls and watched his wife in silence. He saw only a quiet, defeated woman who no longer argued. He smiled to himself, believing he had finally broken her spirit. He never imagined that the greatest threat to his control was no longer rebellion. It was a woman who had already decided to let him believe that every victory was his own. Amara's quiet transformation continued for months. To everyone outside the palace, she remained the graceful and devoted wife of one of the most respected kings in the region. Inside the palace, however, She became a woman the king could no longer understand. She never argued. She never raised her voice. She never openly disobeyed him. Instead, she became quietly disappointing. If the king requested his favorite roast partridge for supper, it arrived slightly overcooked, never burnt, never inedible, just enough to irritate him. If he expected her to receive visiting nobles at precisely the 3rd hour of the afternoon, she arrived a few minutes late with a sincere apology. Whenever he criticized her, she no longer cried or begged for forgiveness. She simply lowered her head and answered calmly, "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I will do better tomorrow." That answer frustrated him more than any argument ever had. There was nothing he could accuse her of, nothing serious enough for others to notice, and yet somehow she exhausted his patience day after day. Ironically, outside the palace she became an even more devoted wife. At royal celebrations, she proudly held his arm. Whenever someone praised the king, she smiled and added, "My husband works harder for this kingdom than anyone realizes." If someone complimented her gown, she always replied, "His Majesty has always taken wonderful care of me." Soon the entire kingdom began praising the king even more than before. People admired his marriage. Young noblemen tried to imitate him. Young ladies dreamed of marrying a king like Osei. The admiration only made him more miserable, for he was trapped inside an image he no longer wished to maintain. Meanwhile, Zuri grew bolder. She no longer hid the confidence in her voice whenever she spoke to the king. During one afternoon stroll through the gardens, she quietly said, "A man of your position deserves a queen worthy of your name." The king remained silent. Encouraged by his silence, she continued, "You carry this kingdom alone. You deserve a wife who inspires you instead of disappointing you." The seed Amara had planted months earlier was finally taking root. Every carefully chosen sentence, every calculated mistake, every polite apology, everything had led to this moment. The breaking point came during the king's annual Great Council feast. Several influential elders, provincial chiefs, wealthy merchants, and members of the Council of Ancestors had gathered inside the great dining hall, and Amara personally welcomed every guest with perfect courtesy. Dinner had barely begun when one servant accidentally poured wine into the wrong crystal cup. It was a tiny mistake, one Amara immediately corrected, but the king had already decided he wanted an audience. He slowly rose from his chair, and the room fell silent. His expression hardened. "I have tolerated incompetence for too long," he said into the silence. Every guest looked toward Amara. He pointed directly at her. "This household has become an embarrassment." His voice echoed across the hall. "You cannot manage servants. You cannot manage this palace. And after all these years, you still cannot give this kingdom the air it deserves." Amara lowered her eyes, and several ladies of the court exchanged uncomfortable glances. No one had expected a king to shame his wife so publicly. Every custom of the realm forbade it. But the king took one final step forward. "From this day forward, you are no longer my wife." Silence. The drums in the courtyard stopped. Even the servants stood frozen. Amara slowly fell to her knees, tears filling her eyes, and she reached toward him with trembling hands. "Please do not cast me aside. I will do better. I will become the wife you deserve." Several noble women began wiping away tears. An elderly elder of the council quietly muttered, "This is cruelty without honor." The king felt triumphant. He believed every word she spoke. He believed he had completely broken her spirit. Only one person in that hall knew the truth, and that person was Amara herself. Behind those tears, her heart was lighter than it had been in years. The prison door had finally opened. The guests watched as servants packed a small leather trunk containing her personal belongings, and she accepted it without protest. As she walked toward the great entrance of the palace, Zuri stepped into her path wearing an elegant gown of gold and indigo that Amara had never seen before. A diamond necklace sparkled around her neck. She smiled with barely concealed satisfaction. "I finally have everything," she said. For a brief moment, Amara looked into the eyes of the woman she had once trusted more than a sister. She almost warned her. She almost told her the truth. Instead, she simply smiled. "Take good care of him." Zuri misunderstood the sadness in her voice. She believed it was defeat. She proudly walked past the former queen toward the grand entrance of the palace. Amara never looked back. By sunset, she reached her parents' cottage in Mwezi village. She knocked gently. and her mother opened the door. The moment Chiamaka saw the travel trunk, her face turned pale. What happened? Before Amara could answer, her father appeared behind her. You have been sent away, he said, and she nodded silently. His expression immediately filled with anger. Do you know what you have done? The king will never forgive this family. Her mother began to cry, but instead of embracing her daughter, she whispered desperately, Go back, fall at his feet, beg him to take you back. Emeka, now a commissioned officer of the king's guard, stepped forward. You promised you would not ruin everything. Even Adeze, who had always adored her sister, lowered her eyes and remained silent. Amara looked at each of them in turn. Not one person asked if she had eaten. Not one person asked where she would sleep. Not one person asked whether she was safe. That night, she rested on a wooden bench outside the cottage. Before sunrise, she quietly picked up her small trunk, and without knocking on the door, without saying goodbye, she walked away from the only family she had ever known. This time, she never intended to return. Amara walked for hours before reaching the nearest town on the Great River. She carried only one small trunk, a few changes of clothing, the gold coins she had secretly saved over the past many months, and the skills she had prayed she would never need. For the first time in years, no one knew where she was. No one could order her. No one could strike her. She was finally free. Yet freedom came with a price. The tiny room she rented above a dyer's shop was barely large enough for a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a small table beneath a single window. When it rained, water slipped through the roof, forcing her to place buckets across the floor before going to sleep. She had never lived in such humble conditions, and yet every night she slept more peacefully than she ever had inside the Golden Pinnacle. Her savings disappeared quickly. She counted every coin before buying food. Most days she survived on bread, cassava soup, and whatever fruit was cheapest at the market. There were evenings when hunger kept her awake, and still she never once regretted leaving. Every morning she reminded herself, a poor woman with peace is richer than a queen living in fear. She devoted every spare hour to her loom. Mama Effia had taught her patterns reserved for the king's own regalia, and now she practiced them until her hands could move without hesitation. She wove late into the night beneath the dim light of a single oil lamp. Her fingers became swollen. Splinters of thread in the bite of the needle pierced her skin countless times. Sometimes drops of blood stained the cloth, and she would quietly wash the fabric, wrap a bandage around her finger, and continue working. Giving up was no longer an option. Her first finished piece, a ceremonial scarf, sold for only a few silver coins. It was not much, but it proved that someone was willing to pay for her work. The following week she completed another, then a pair of woven shawls, then a cloth decorated with patterns of gold and crimson thread. Slowly, customers returned. One merchant's wife admired her craftsmanship and ordered a custom table cover. A visiting baroness requested woven pillow covers for her estate. Soon word spread among the noble ladies of the capital. Everyone wanted to know the identity of the mysterious weaver whose work rivaled that of the royal artisans. Amara never used her title. She introduced herself only by her given name. Her reputation grew because of her talent, not because of her past. Within a year, she rented a larger workshop and hired 2 young widows who desperately needed work. Months later, she employed 6 women. Before long, elegant carriages lined the street outside her shop. The same aristocrats who had once admired her as a queen now admired her as a successful businesswoman. None of them recognized her at first. She had changed, not only in appearance, but in confidence. Meanwhile, preparations for another wedding filled the Golden Pinnacle. Zuri Nyuruga stood before a mirror while servants carefully fastened a magnificent diamond necklace around her neck. She admired herself endlessly. I always knew this life was meant for me, she said proudly. The wedding became the biggest event of the season. The kingdom celebrated the king's new marriage. Guests praised the bride's beauty. Many whispered that she looked even happier than Amara ever had. Young ladies envied her. Older nobles congratulated the king on beginning a new chapter, exactly as they had once envied the first queen. Zuri believed she had finally won. For the first week after the wedding, life felt exactly as she had imagined. The king smiled often. He surprised her with expensive jewels. They rode together through the palace grounds every afternoon. He even asked her opinion during council meetings. She proudly believed she had succeeded where her former friend had failed. During the second week, subtle changes appeared. The king became quieter. His patience grew shorter. He criticized little things that had never mattered before: the flowers she chose for the dining hall, the arrangement of the sitting room, the timing of afternoon tea. Whenever she laughed too loudly, he frowned. Whenever she spoke during conversations with guests, he corrected her. She convinced herself that he was merely under pressure. By the third week, the illusion ended. One evening, she accidentally interrupted him while he was reading the War Council scrolls. "I thought you might like some tea," she said gently. The king slowly looked up. "I did not ask for tea. I'm sorry. I only wanted—" The slap came without warning. She stumbled sideways, one hand pressed against her burning cheek. She stood perfectly still, unable to move, unable to speak. The room around her suddenly felt painfully familiar. She was standing in the exact place where Amara had once stood countless times. Fragments of old memories rushed back into her mind. The strange sadness in Amara's eyes, the forced smiles, the hesitation whenever anyone praised the king, the quiet words spoken on the day Amara left. "Take good care of him." For the first time, Zuri understood what those words truly meant. Ashamed to admit the truth, she hid everything. When the ladies of the court asked about the bruise near her jaw, she smiled. "I bumped into a door." A week later, another mark appeared. "I slipped while walking down the stairs." Soon she stopped wearing gowns with open necklines. High collars became part of every outfit. Long sleeves covered the bruises on her arms. Powder concealed the discoloration beneath her eyes. Without realizing it, she had become exactly what Amara used to be, a woman the kingdom envied, and no one truly knew. Merely a year had passed since Zuri became queen. To the outside world, she was living the dream every noble woman desired. She attended royal celebrations dressed in magnificent gowns. She rode beside the king during public ceremonies. People bowed as she passed through the capital. Women admired her jewels. Young ladies whispered that she had become the most fortunate queen in the kingdom. No one knew the truth. Every morning she spent nearly an hour covering bruises before facing the world. Every evening she wondered what small mistake would provoke the king next. Sometimes it was because dinner arrived a few minutes late. Sometimes because she greeted the wrong guest first. Other times there was no reason at all. She finally understood something that haunted her every waking moment. The king had never needed a reason. He simply needed someone weaker than himself. One rainy afternoon, after another violent argument, Zuri stood before the mirror inside her dressing room. A swollen bruise stretched beneath her left eye, and her lower lip was split. As she stared at her own reflection, another face appeared in her memory. Amara. She remembered the forced smiles, the quiet sadness, the strange pity in Amara's eyes on the day she left the palace. Then those unforgettable words echoed inside her mind once again. "Take good care of him." For the first time, she understood that they had never been spoken with jealousy. They had been spoken with compassion. That realization broke her completely. The following morning, disguised beneath a plain traveling cloak and walking instead of taking the palace carriage, Zuri secretly left the Golden Pinnacle. After asking several merchants for directions, she finally arrived at a modest but elegant weaving house in the capital. Its windows displayed exquisite cloth and handcrafted garments admired throughout the kingdom. She hesitated before entering, and a young assistant welcomed her politely. "Can I help you, my lady? I am here to see the owner." Moments later, Amara appeared. She looked different, healthier, confident, peaceful. For several long seconds, neither woman spoke. Zuri expected anger. She expected accusations. Instead, Amara smiled gently. "You have come a long way." She led Zuri into a private sitting room, and without asking any questions, she poured tea into 2 porcelain cups. They sat together in silence, and the quiet felt heavier than any conversation. Finally, Zuri began to cry. "I thought I had won," she said, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "I thought you were jealous." She lowered her head. "Why did you not stop me?" Amara looked at her with quiet understanding. Then she asked one simple question. "Would you have believed me?" Zuri searched her own heart for the answer. She remembered how desperately she had wanted the crown, the palace, the king. She remembered convincing herself that her friend simply was not good enough for such a powerful man. Slowly, she shook her head. No. That single word carried more regret than 1,000 apologies. Amara reached across the table and gently held her hand. I do not hate you. I stopped hating you the day I walked away from that palace. Fresh tears rolled down Zuri's face. I am sorry, I stole your life. Amara gave a faint smile. No, you stole the prison I no longer wanted. Those words remained in Zuri's mind long after she returned to the palace, and that night she made a decision. She would leave. No crown, no jewels, no fortune was worth living in fear. She locked herself inside her room and carefully wrote a letter to her father, begging him to come for her. She confessed everything she had hidden since her wedding, the beatings, the lies, the bruises. She ended the letter with one heartbreaking sentence. Father, if you do not come now, I do not think I will survive much longer. Before dawn, she secretly handed the sealed letter to a young stable boy named Kofi. Please make sure this reaches my father. The frightened servant nodded and hurried away. Unfortunately, he never reached the palace gates. The king intercepted him in the inner courtyard. Minutes later, the king entered Zuri's room holding the opened letter in his hand, and his face was filled with terrifying rage. So, you have been begging for rescue? Zuri's heart stopped, and she slowly stepped backward. The king ripped the letter into tiny pieces and threw them across the room. You ungrateful woman! I gave you everything, and now you wish to disgrace my name? She turned toward the door, and he blocked her path. She tried to run past him, and he grabbed her arm. She struggled desperately. Please let me leave. His answer was a violent shove. Zuri stumbled backward. Her heels slipped on the polished marble floor. She lost her balance, and she fell. Her body rolled helplessly down the long staircase of the palace before crashing onto the marble below. The sound echoed through the golden pinnacle. Servants rushed into the entrance hall, and Mama Amma screamed for the physician. Doctors fought for hours to save her life. By evening they succeeded, but the victory came with a terrible cost. The physician quietly informed the household, Her Majesty will live, but the injury to her neck cannot be repaired. Unable to move anything below her shoulders, Zuri lay silently in bed, and she understood the truth before anyone dared speak it. She was not going to recover. The following morning, she made only one request. She did not ask for the king. She refused to see her father. She requested neither priests nor noble visitors. Looking at the elderly housekeeper, she whispered with the little strength she had left, "Please bring me my friend." Amara arrived at the golden pinnacle just before sunset. It was the first time she had stepped through those gates since the day she had been cast out, and everything looked the same. The great fountains still stood in the center of the courtyard. The flower gardens were still perfectly trimmed. The gold-leafed pillars still reflected the golden evening light. Yet something had changed. The palace no longer felt powerful, it felt haunted. Mama Amma met her at the entrance and, without saying a word, embraced her tightly. Tears streamed down the old woman's wrinkled cheeks. "I prayed you would never have to return here," she whispered. Amara gently squeezed her hand. "I am not here for him. I am here for her." The housekeeper silently led her upstairs. The room was painfully quiet. Curtains had been drawn to soften the sunlight, and the scent of medicine filled the air. Zuri lay motionless on the bed. The confident young woman who had once dreamed of becoming queen had disappeared. Her face had become pale. Her breathing was shallow. Only her eyes moved. When she saw her former friend enter the room, fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. The servants quietly left, closing the door behind them. For several moments, neither woman spoke. Amara slowly walked to the bedside and gently took Zuri's hand. It felt cold, fragile, barely alive. Zuri struggled to speak. I stole." Her voice broke. "I stole your husband." Amara gently shook her head. "No." A faint smile appeared on her face. "You took my prison." Zuri closed her eyes, and more tears escaped. I thought I had won." "You did," Amara answered softly. "You won everything I had prayed to lose." Silence filled the room again. After a long moment, Zuri whispered the question that had haunted her since visiting the weaving house. Can you forgive me?" Amara gently brushed a strand of hair away from Zuri's forehead. I forgave you the day I walked away from this palace. You were never my greatest enemy. We were both victims of the same man. Zuri wept quietly. Thank you. Those were the last clear words she ever spoke. 2 days later, she passed away peacefully before sunrise. Her father arrived at the palace only hours after her death. He had originally traveled there because disturbing rumors about his daughter's marriage had reached his estate. Instead, he found his only child dead. Grief quickly turned into determination. He gave the investigators a detailed account of everything he had witnessed. The frightened stable boy admitted that the king had intercepted the letter begging for help. Mama Amma finally revealed years of abuse she had silently endured while serving the royal household. One by one, the servants found the courage to speak. The physician confirmed that both of the queen's misfortunes had resulted from violent assaults. The kitchen staff described countless nights of shouting. The guards testified about broken furniture and terrified maids. The carefully crafted image of the perfect king collapsed piece by piece. The investigation lasted several weeks, and when it ended, the verdict shocked the kingdom. The Council of Elders, by the ancient law of the realm, stripped King Osei Kankam of his crown and his name. He was tried for years of brutal violence that had ultimately led to the death of his second wife. His title was abolished by the decree of the council. The golden pinnacle was seized in the name of the kingdom, and his wealth was divided according to the law. The man once praised as the realm's model king became a warning whispered to young women throughout the 7 provinces. Parents no longer pointed toward his portrait with admiration. They pointed toward it with sorrow. Years passed, and Amara never returned to courtly life. She did not need another crown. She had built something far greater. Her weaving house had become the most respected cloth establishment in the kingdom. Queens, princesses, ambassadors from beyond the desert, all commissioned cloth bearing her signature craftsmanship. More importantly, she employed dozens of women who had once struggled as she had. Many were widows. Some had escaped violent marriages. Others had nowhere else to go. She gave them honest work, fair wages, and dignity. One quiet afternoon, her assistant entered the workshop. "My lady, there are visitors asking to see you." She stepped outside, and standing near the entrance were her father, her mother, her brother Emeka in his officer's uniform, and her sister Adaze. Time had aged them all. Okoye Nwosu, once proud and stubborn, slowly dropped to his knees. His wife covered her face as she cried. Emeka lowered his head. "We failed you," he said, and the words were barely audible. "We chose comfort over our own daughter. We have regretted it every day." Amara listened without interrupting, and when they finished, she spoke calmly. "I forgave all of you long ago." Relief spread across their faces, and her mother reached toward her hopefully. Then Amara continued, "But forgiveness does not restore trust. I wish you peace. I wish you health. And if hardship ever finds you again, I will never allow you to go hungry." She paused before finishing. "But I cannot return to the life we once had. My heart healed because I walked away. I will not open wounds that finally closed." Her family understood. There would be no angry farewell, no dramatic rejection, only acceptance. Amara watched them leave before quietly returning to her workshop, where the women inside greeted her with warm smiles, and the sound of laughter filled the room. For the first time in many years, she realized that she no longer measured her worth by the crown she had lost. She measured it by the life she had rebuilt. She had once believed that surviving was enough. Now she understood something far greater. Sometimes the greatest triumph is not destroying the people who hurt you. It is refusing to let them decide who you become. And that was the one victory no enemy, no king, and no empire could ever take away from her.